Hi everyone, today we're looking at a book titled Boomerang, written by Michael Lewis and subtitled The Meltdown Tour, and it's exactly that. It's a tour of countries that have been most devastated by the global financial crisis, and that's a tour that he's taken, and it's really the funniest, most insightful book on the GFC that you're likely to read aside from his other books, and we'll get to that shortly. So I can't recommend this book high enough. The subject of these videos is outlined here. So I'm going to talk a little about, in this video, the author and his motivation for the book and his background, and one of the countries implicated here, or one of the countries more to the point that he visited, is Iceland. The other videos in this series will cover Greece and Ireland. Okay, so about the author and his motivation for this book. It's worth pointing out that he's written probably the best book on the GFC which I've ever found, so please go out and read it if you haven't already. It's The Big Short, and that book really speaks more to the financial instruments and the why and how of the GFC. So if you want some background, please go off and read that book. But during the process, or in the process of writing that book and in the research, he was talking to traders, and they were actually warning him that, back in 2008, that yes, this thing's bad and companies are going to go default, but maybe it's even worse than that, and that countries could go into default. And so through the trading, in researching and talking to traders, he found that those who had predicted the GFC were also telling him that in 2008 that the crisis wasn't over, and that it was being smothered by credit that was coming from the Western governments and all those bailouts. And so what these traders, who had actually already had a track record of successfully predicting the GFC, they were no longer talking about the collapse of a few bonds, they were actually talking about the collapse of entire countries. And some of them were saying things like, there's a disbelief that a developed country can default because we've never seen it in our lifetime, so that's why it wasn't getting a lot of coverage back then. And these traders, like this guy, Kyle Bass, started taking out insurance, credit default swaps, on the countries that he felt most likely to fail. If you want to know about credit default swaps, again, go back and read The Big Short. It's a fantastic some information there on those, but essentially just betting that these countries are going to fail. Some of these countries that these traders were telling that were in trouble were Iceland, Greece and Ireland, and these are the subject of the book. He's gone off and visited these countries and made his observations about not only how they got there, but more to the point, some of the cultural traits that are quite interesting that might have led them to get into the trouble more so than what they needed to. So looking at Iceland, first and foremost, I don't know much about Iceland, but let's place it on the map. There it is, highlighted in red, kind of in the middle of some other place and some other place. So, and again, so I'm not pretending to know much about Iceland, and neither did he. And there's Bjorg, so we probably know a little bit of her. But Iceland, how big a problem was it? Well, they, organised themselves to commit one of the greatest acts of madness in financial history. And to that, $100 billion in losses. And to put that in perspective, because we lose perspective when we hear about deficits in the US and all the rest of it in trillions, $100 billion in losses equates to $330,000 for every person in Iceland. And 1 week after the collapse in 2008, a third of the population said they wanted to migrate somewhere else. An IMF representative said Iceland is no longer a country, it's a hedge fund. That's how bad things were. Just catastrophe. So just setting up the fact that this thing blew up in their face. What actually happened? Well, just a really crude little timeline here. 2002 in Iceland, there were 3 banks. The 3 biggest banks were capitalized at a few $1 billion. As we move along the timeline, what happened is that we saw the most rapid expansion of the banking system in the history of mankind in Iceland. And as we moved into the GFC boom, or explosion, if I will, the 3 biggest banks in 2008 were capitalized at 140 billion. So you can see something crazy was happening in Iceland. What was happening is that essentially a lot of activity in the finance sector. Iceland was just built up with fishermen and aluminium smelters in more recent times. But fishermen, looking in Iceland, the author makes a point that even fishermen got involved in the yen currency trade. So during this boom time, everyone was involved in this industry. So he would borrow yen at 3%, buy local assets, and as the krona rose, watch my wealth explode. So good old fishermen and good old cab drivers got involved. Cab drivers were option trading using the old black skulls method. So it permeated right through society. So everyone was involved in this industry. What did it boil down to? Well, it really boiled down to this. It was just a handful of guys in Iceland who had no experience in finance. They were taking out tens of billion dollars in short-term loans from abroad, and then they would re-lend this money to themselves and their friends being fishermen, cab drivers, and all the rest. And really, the principle was buy an asset, and buy any asset. Didn't matter, banks, soccer teams, it all looked good while asset prices were rising. So even if you bought a shitty soccer team, excuse the language, I'm not sure if that's a bad team, it could be great, I just grabbed that from the web somewhere, but you just buy assets, and that was the principle of what they were doing. One of the funny things that Michael Lewis talks about, well, it's not really so funny, but it was interesting to me because it's got so many ethical dilemmas here. This thing called creating fake capital, and what's that mean, and how do they do it? It was endemic in Iceland, and a lot of people point this as to why they kind of blew up more so than others. They would buy trading assets amongst themselves at deflated value. So let me bring this to life a little for you. Say this is you, and you have a cat. It's a well-fed cat. And this is me, and I have a dog, well-fed as well. What if I was to sell you this dog for $1 billion, and you were to sell me that cat for $1 billion? We agreed that they were worth $1 billion, and we sold each of them. Well, if you did that, after the sale, we were no longer pet owners but Icelandic banks with $1 billion in new assets. I can't say this word very well. You legitimize the assets by selling them to each other. You put them on your balance sheet. So I've got $1 billion of assets, and aren't I great? I've got a bank now that can borrow money abroad and look very healthy, but really all I've got is a fat dog. So that was creating fake capital, and this is one of the big mechanisms that they use to kind of look great to outsiders. But why Iceland? Well, we assume that as there are so few Icelanders in the world, that they are Scandinavian and gentle in nature. The author points out that this is not the case. They have a feral streak in them like a horse that is pretending to be broken. So here's a horse. So if you look at some of the traits that he talks about with Icelanders, if you've got an untamed kind of horse, you add a dominant male culture. In fact, in the finance industry, not one, I think one woman in a senior position in an Icelandic bank in the entire industry. You add that, and you add a kind of air of superiority that the author points out, and they tend to think that they were superior when it comes to high finance because they were able to utilize informal channels of communication and able to make decisions very quickly, so they were very happy with that. So if you were to just look back over that, you've got these traits along here, a horse and men, and a horse, kind of untamed nature, predominantly male culture and industry, and this area of superiority. You've got all of these factors building up to a level of arrogance, perhaps, or superiority. Well, what happens when that happens? So, they bought quickly. They bought something that they did, and they did it very quickly. Why was that? Well, usually the author points out because the seller is very satisfied with the price. So you are looking at a situation where they're the new kids on the block. Iceland only really came into the banking scene in 2002, 2003. And like any new kid on the block, they were picked off by the various people, then sold them the lowest quality assets, and they were in all the worst LBOs. So they're in a hiding to nothing, new kids on the block in a high finance, and they were getting taken advantage of, and subsequently expedited their demise. So really, that was all the kind of interesting points in the Iceland visit. There was heaps more, obviously, but I had no time for that. I'll just leave with this comment with respect to Iceland and a lot of the other details in this video and the subsequent ones. When you borrow a lot of money to create a false prosperity, you import the future into the present. It isn't the actual future so much as some grotesque silicon version of it. Leverage buys you a glimpse of a prosperity that you've never really earned. So that was just kind of a principle that's made there that's certainly relevant for Iceland. Okay, so that's Iceland, and that's the first video actually. So stay tuned for the part 2 of this video presentation, which include Greece.